When we spoke last, you talked about finding your tribe, and that word especially 100% resonates with us. So tell us about your tribe and what it meant for you to find it.
Part of the quirkiness of my work, both now and when I first got into it, is that I didn't even really know that this was a thing. In 2009, when I initially got this job, I had been doing basically a lot of, sort of facilitation and what I would call shuttle diplomacy, really, for an elected official in Austin. And this whole idea that there could be something called public engagement, that there was a sort of method behind what I felt was sort of the madness of working with the public, was a totally foreign concept. And so my boss said, go to this conference. And it was the International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2, San Diego, I want to say September 2009. And I can still describe to you the ballroom. Like, it was just one of those moments, like,
Right.
you're sitting there and you're just thinking, like, finally, I have my people. And don't get me wrong. I had gone to, like, when I was with NPR, like, I would go to some public radio conferences and journalism conferences. And a lot of times you feel, at least at that time in my life, some kinship there. But it is so different because it's such a misunderstood or understood or not understood thing, that to be in a room with people who have some of the shorthand, and the jargon and sort of the I love public meetings kind of vibe is so uncommon that it became a really irresistible kind of force in my life. So much so that I ended up getting really involved with IP2. So, but I just want to emphasize, I guess, that it doesn't have to come in the form of a professional association and a conference and a, expensive kind of time-consuming thing. A lot of times, especially with the advent of sort of the meetups and the Reddits of the world, we can find our tribe in ways that don't, require getting on an airplane or spending a few days at a conference or joining a formal organization. But I do think that when it comes to this particular work, it's been especially rewarding to be in those kinds of settings, because a lot of times people who do this work are either sole practitioners, or, like me, they were one of a very small number of people in a big organization that, know about this stuff or think about it in any detail or dream about it in their sleep. So, so it was great to meet other people like that.
Yeah, well, we have giant smiles on our faces because we can
totally understand
that 100%. That's how we feel about the work that we're doing and the people that we're lucky enough to do with. So when you said that we really lit up when you said that, because it's exciting to hear other people talk about finding their tribe. So
for sure.
Well, I was fortunate to work with you when you facilitated some meetings for the City of Fort Worth Water Department regarding moving to a permanent twice per week watering restrictions. Why do you think it's so important for government, especially water utilities, who typically are always behind the scenes, to engage in that kind of public engagement?
So I feel like there's kind of a couple of different ways to come at that question. One is that I've just got this kind of operating principle that people who are affected by a decision ought to be able to affect that decision. And notice I didn't say, like, voters affected by, or citizens, or people who pay taxes. I'm not even restricting it to public agencies. Frankly, some of what I think we've seen in recent years is that private corporations have gotten themselves into tough situations when they've made decisions that their employees can't get behind, that weren't involved in. There's that. There's kind of the value associated with just participatory democracy, and the idea that if you're going to ask me to do something to change my habits, or to pay more for something, as in the case of a tax increase or a bond or something like that, or you're going to change the terms of the relationship we have as citizen and government, meaning like a charter amendment or a constitutional revision or whatever. I just, I think the outcomes are a lot better when the folks affected by a decision get a chance to affect it. But from the standpoint of a utility, or for that matter, any agency. I mean, I sometimes use the metaphor of going to a primary care physician for a regular checkup as compared to going to the emergency room.
Ah,
A lot of times the 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 urgency to go to the doctor when you're otherwise healthy or not super sick is pretty low. You're like,
Right.
why do I need to waste the time, the waiting rooms, whatever? But we all know, for those of us who are lucky to have ever been covered by health insurance, that's a pretty cheap and easy way to address your health, whatever that situation may be, as compared to going to the hospital, which we know is extremely time consuming and usually extremely expensive and often pretty traumatic. Um, Public agencies, a lot of times, and we can talk about more examples of this later on, often find themselves going to the metaphorical emergency room. And that can look a lot of different ways. That can be a petition drive that leads to a ballot measure to reverse or repeal or overturn what elected officials have said they want to do, or unelected officials for that matter have said they want to do. That can be a recall election. That can be a lawsuit. That can be people standing in the street and expending a lot of police and public safety overtime to deal with that. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that that can manifest itself. But the ultimate outcome ends up being that the agency spends a lot of money and usually a lot of political capital and a lot of energy and effort to clean up a mess, to go to the emergency room and clean up a mess, as opposed to getting in front of it and, doing not necessarily totally preventative care, but certainly something that is more like going to the primary care doctor than going to the emergency room. So, I mean, I can also talk about the impact it can have on a elected official's reelection, the impact that it can have on people's desire to keep living in a place. I think that the benefits of this can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, many of which may not be that consequential to that frontline government worker or even utility executive, but still matter sometimes to people that are their bosses. And so I just think that there's kind of the normative principle and value around just letting people have a say in something that's going to affect them, which is a good thing for our entire lives, frankly. And then the more kind of cut and dry, down and dirty version, which is you're probably going to save a bunch of money and you're probably going to have a lot more satisfied community members when you do it that way.
Yeah.
I think that's like my new favorite metaphor for
Mhm.
it, because we talk a lot about proactive, consistent communication and the value of that. But yeah, it really is like a primary care versus an emergency situation.
Well, and one of the things that is, I think, jarring about, just to go back into the metaphor for a second, jarring about the emergency room is you don't know the doctor, you don't know the nurse. You may have been at that hospital before because, whatever, but it's a lot of people you don't know. The primary care physician, Well, to
Yeah.
put that back on a utility or a government agency, if the first time I'm hearing from you is to tell me not to drink the water, um, see Texas, Austin, October 2018.
Hello.
You know, um,
Yeah.
that's totally different than, oh, I was just at a community meeting, 2 weeks ago, and they told us that there's a situation and we need to be aware of it. And this is my elected official telling me that I've known since she or he got elected, years ago or whatever. So, um, we're talking about, I think, first and foremost, the abstract concept of trust building and the more concrete concept of relationship building, which we all know is important in any form of communication, but particularly when we're trying to get the community to understand and perhaps be a part of a tough fix to a problem.
Nice. I'm slow clapping that.
I know. I love it. I love it. So, in a presentation you gave to City Council around that same time, you said, I would rather you not do public engagement than do it and not use any information you got from it. What are some examples you've seen in your work where organizations have really nailed this and truly made public engagement efforts a collaboration?
Yeah, so I'm going to be careful with this one not to talk just about examples from Austin, because that would be way too.
No, you can be anonymous.
That would be super Austin-y to talk about Austin as being great, but also to pretend like nothing great is going on. So I actually would say at the outset that people really ought to check out what's called the Core Value Awards that are given by IAP2. and I
Ooh.
can send a link that you guys
Yes.
can put in the notes or whatever. Because first of all, a lot of the best practice is actually coming from Australia and Canada.
Okay.
Partly because of the frameworks there around what you have to do when it comes to involving the public, which are certainly less of a big deal here and sometimes just absent. But also just, I think that, those are two nations that have just generally embraced this concept for years, if not decades longer than the United States has. So that's point number one. And there are other kind of collections of what I'll call best practices that are easy to find for free. You don't have to be a member of anything. You don't have to be a member of IEP2, by the way, to look at those award winners. But I'll, like I said, I'll send you guys some links there. I wanted to spotlight one particular process that I thought, well, I'm going to do two actually, that I thought were reflections of really truly incorporating what the public wanted. So, Stephanie mentioned the water restrictions in Fort Worth. So actually, that was preceded, if I'm not mistaken, by a similar process in Austin with the Austin Water Utility. And
Yes.
I specifically remember not really I'm not going to go into like the specifics of how we engaged in that particular process so much as just to say that there were some people very uneasy with the ultimate recommendations the utility made to council on that front. But I do remember one in particular going to the council and basically saying, I'm willing to support this because the process was fair. I could see that you allowed all of the different perspectives to be heard, whether it be environmental activists or car wash operators or irrigators or just homeowners or whatever. He's like, I could tell that all of those perspectives were being heeded. And so even if you're not delivering kind of the perfect solution for me in my particular vantage point, I'm not going to make a big fuss because you did what you should based on what you heard and what you had a fair process to get to that place.
Wow. That's awesome.
The other example though that I was going to give was one in which I think the agency came from a much more forward-thinking place in terms of action to handle a particular issue. So this is the agency known as Austin Resource Recovery, which is essentially the recycling and trash part of our city operations. And they really didn't know what to do about the fact that a lot of recyclable material was ending up in the landfill. And so they sort of put out this kind of generalized, like, what do we do? What do you think we should do? Kind of call, which netted over 1,000 different ideas, which then sort of evolved into a few more concrete proposals. And I was lucky enough to get to host a televised town hall meeting on this, where we got, hundreds of people dialed in or connected to weigh in on the specific matter of, would you pay X number of dollars more per month for more frequent recycling pickup or for curbside composting pickup? And they really, I know the folks involved and I know their decision-making process, and they weren't committed to any particular outcome until all of that was done. And I believe the net effect was to start curbside compost across the city, but to wait on increasing the frequency of recycling. So, the overarching points there really are: go in with an open mind. Don't begin a process having made decisions that you're then going to ask the public for input on.
Yeah.
If it's not to say that you shouldn't have made any decisions. I mean, look, there are public safety and health and other considerations that you may not be willing to bend on full stop, or financial considerations that you can't bend on for any reason. That's totally fine and understandable. Let's just be transparent about that and say, we're not going to discuss that. Like, if that's something you want to pursue, like, yes, go talk to city council or the legislature, but the parameters of this discussion are X. And only ask about those things where you really think there's a chance that you would be influenced by what the public ends up telling you, and be able to demonstrate. I think it's key, be able to close that feedback loop for them and demonstrate, you said this and we did this as a result of your telling us this.
Yeah.
So that they can understand where this came from, that it wasn't just a boardroom where people just hatched these ideas, but in fact something that they were influenced by the public in deciding. So like I said, I hate to give two Austin examples, but I do think that I do think that what really makes them stand out to me isn't so much the design of the public engagement, but simply the agency's willingness to kind of hold back until those processes ran their course, and then they could incorporate the findings, meaningfully into their eventual decisions.
Yeah, I was nodding a lot while you were telling that second story because I'm actually familiar with that because I was when we worked for another city, did a lot of work in the environmental services portion, and they asked me to look at what Austin was doing, and I saw like all of that process that they went through, and it was incredible. I was so fired up. I wish you could have done something like that in the city that we were at. But
I mean, we wanted to have a public meeting just to host it that way. Like, it was so powerful. It's like, wow.
Yeah. Well, and the thing, there's two things that I think made it stand out. One was the way that they attacked the question. I think was sort of novel. Like, they could have said, sort of in a more generalized way, like, we just want to get to zero waste, or we just want to, improve sustainability in Austin or something. But they were very concrete. I mean, they were presenting it from a data-based place that people could appreciate. Like, that's ridiculous that we're sending all this trash, recyclables to the landfill. And then also, I think they really wanted people just to imagine a way to fix that. And I feel like a lot of times the public isn't asked something that basic. A lot of times the public is presented with a lot of technical information and expected to respond in a way that's hard for someone without the education and background to do. And so this was like so kind of bottom line in a way that it, I think, helped a lot of people feel like the process was accessible.
Yeah, and they really did their homework in understanding their audience, which I thought was amazing. Like, to really ask, why do you recycle? Why don't you recycle? Do you because when you're doing that work and you're passionate about it, you put these assumptions of what you think and feel and your reasons on other people, where there's some people who are like, that's not even on their radar,
For sure.
And it's not because they're bad people. It's just because it's not there yet. And so,
and that's a great point for a couple of reasons. So the in-person meetings on the composting recycling topic were not well attended. I mean, I bet the most I got at any of the 3 or 4 of them was 20 people. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that to say it's bad or good. It's just that's the way it was.
Yeah.
and that's pretty normal when it's not like an existential threat to your existence, to your lifestyle or whatever. Yeah. I mean, certainly we see meetings much better attended, but a lot of times they're because something has reached a boiling point. Mm-hmm. But as a result, that was one of the reasons why I think the department bought into my suggestion to do something virtual, because they saw that if they didn't, it was going to be hard for them to have a meaningful sample of public information, public data, to be able to make a decision, much less kind of an iterative conversation. And back to your point about kind of getting people to walk in other shoes, I still remember one of the people who called into that meeting saying, like, we don't even have enough for the every 2 weeks pickup of recycling that you're doing now. So please don't start picking up weekly, because that doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, most of the environmental activists on that point obviously were taking a somewhat different, kind of more recycling now kind of thing. And so, not that either side is right or wrong, but I just think it would have been hard for the agency to hear that had there not been other ways for people to give that kind of input.
Well, I have to give a shout out right quick. You would be very proud of Kathy Bailey, who is the executive director for the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, and the work that she's done on their lead pipe replacement program in Cincinnati. And I mean, they met with 52 different community meetings, and they took them their ideas, and they would get their feedback and bring it back to the war room, if you will, and say, okay, they said this will work, this won't work. And they made those changes and came back. And exactly like you said, when it got approved, it was like, well, of course it got approved. Like, you guys, there was so much buy-in because they had built that trust and that relationship with the community. Mm-hmm. And so I hope one day we get to master the meeting of you and Kathy, because I think that you would love her story.
I sure would. Yeah. And, I also think it's important to take as a cautionary tale the idea that not many people showing up at a meeting means that everything's cool.
Oh gosh.
Which is, something that I've heard elected officials say something to that effect verbatim when I'm speaking like a Texas Municipal League or something, like,
Mm.
well, we don't get a lot of people at such and such a hearing, so
Probably not a
It's
big deal.
fine.
we're good. And there was actually, to the credit of everybody else there, a collective laugh before I responded to that question. So,
I'm sure your face said it all. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah. okay. but I think that that's especially important for a utility to consider. Like, you're going to get attendance when there's something really challenging going on.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I like to tell people we have sort of metaphorical buckets of time in our lives, and I'm saying we, like human beings. We work or we go to school. We, take it easy, and a lot of us have families and spend time with them. There's not a bucket for like going to public meetings. Like, that doesn't
There's
exist.
not.
There
Is
are
there
definitely
even,
people
like, a
who seem
teacup?
to there's definitely
symbol.
people who seem to make their living, I call them super citizens. I've heard a lot of different other terms for them, who seem to make their living on going to these meetings. And to be serious, there certainly are people whose living includes going to some of these meetings for one reason or another. But in terms of an issue that I care about personally, I'm not going to go to a public meeting that's scheduled at the usual kind of dinner time-ish time,
Yeah.
unless there's just like some overwhelming reason that my physically being there would be important.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's funny because down in Fort Lauderdale, where we are now, there's a zoning land use kind of fight, and we've got friends who have rescheduled on us a couple of times to go to a 7:00 meeting on that particular
Wow.
topic. And up to now, like, we've known them for years, I never have heard them say, we're going to a community meeting to, deal with something. So I just think that that's something that's very exceptional in terms of people's habits. And so utilities and other public agencies should think to themselves, what does this attendance tell us? And what other ways should we be targeting the population we're trying to reach?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can learn a lot from studying mistakes. So, on the flip side of that, can you give us some examples of where people have completely bombed this? And you've got like this list of clients that are like, okay, don't do this.
Yeah. So I'm gonna
You don't have to give names.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I'm gonna tell two without naming either municipalities or agencies or anything. But I was hired once by a city government, and I asked them. It was for training, and so I asked them, if what precipitated this. I mean, sometimes you just have really forward-thinking, leadership who understands that public engagement is really important, and they need to train their folks. And then most of the time, it's because there was some god-awful mess.
Yeah.
And so there was a god-awful mess in this case. And the short version of it was that there had been an infrastructure project that I guess was being done in multiple parts of their city, kind of almost on repeat, like the same kind of project in multiple locations. And in one particular section of the city, maybe not coincidentally the lower income area, let's just say there wasn't a whole lot of engagement. And so the project was moving forward in a way that was actually, from what I read, having real consequences, like as in trouble, like breathing, trouble with health, like physical problems, not to mention the political ramifications. So the project was canceled, but the ultimate, what's the word? The ultimate financial hit to that was something on the order of $15 million. Now, that's not exceptional in the world of canceled infrastructure, but I'm sure that people listening to this are probably thinking like,
I don't have $15
oh my
million.
goodness, like I don't have that amount of money, but also like that if that happened on my watch, like I don't know that I would have a job.
Yeah.
It's less about the raw number in terms of like how much that mattered to that particular agency, and more just about the symbolism of quote unquote wasting that amount of money. And again, I think that, the way that the folks in this city told it, it was like, had we done the work up front, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe we would have been able to move forward on the project and not quote unquote wasted that money. There was another one that I found really interesting. It's I'm going to do my best to kind of explain it in a way that's going to apply to as many people as possible. But we all know that sort of online and social media as a playing field for engagement is continuing to expand and grow. And so a lot of clients and agencies are certainly using kind of the existing platforms as a way to connect. And so in this case, it was a Twitter-based conversation that a community was having. And I don't remember the prompt, but it was something pretty general, like, what would you like to see in the future of your community or something. And a person's tweet back was, it had an acronym in it that didn't mean anything to me. It wouldn't mean anything to you guys, but everybody in that city would know what it means. It'd be like saying DFW or whatever. I mean, everybody knew what it was. And the firm that was kind of moderating that or responding to those tweets said something very innocuous, like, for those of us who don't know what that stands for, would you tell us what it means? I'm not exaggerating when I say that tweet essentially got that firm fired. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? What was going on there? Well, essentially what unraveled at that point was an accusation from the public, or at least the people in that particular conversation, that whoever was behind this account was totally tone deaf as to what was going on in town. And that because they were not from in town, meaning they were from whatever, Dallas, and it was happening in Austin or whatever it was, that they couldn't possibly, like, there was almost like just a counterintuitive, like, how could ever a firm outside of our community get this? How could they ever? And that's not the point that I would take away from this story by any means, nor would I even say that the way that they phrased that tweet as a question was even that far off. I mean, I guess they could have said, oh, you're referring to, and then just spell out the acronym and then move on, and maybe it would have been less consequential. But I think that what it reflects is the challenges and limitations associated with any form of engagement. I mean, literally any way that you engage, whether it's a face-to-face meeting, a public workshop, a public hearing, something online that's on a place like Facebook or Twitter, something that's online that you create, something that's via text message, something on TV. I mean, anything is going to have limitations associated with it. And the more that you can study and understand those ahead of time, the better off you're going to be. And that, for me, looks like not just testing like a website to see if it works or has no bugs in it, which is of course important, but also like let's role play a post that's like supercharged and figure out how we would respond to it, because those are going to come. And I'm certainly seeing some agencies kind of say like, oh, we had this disastrous back and forth on Facebook, so we're never going on Facebook again or something. And I'm not really going there. I'm just saying that we need to know what we're getting ourselves into, whatever the medium may be. And then we need to kind of think through how will what we say be received. I was also at a face-to-face meeting, I remember, where someone, the moderator said something like, she said something like, we want everybody to remain calm, or we want everybody to kind of, something like that, stay calm or something. And so, of course, that's true. Like, of course, everybody should stay calm. But it was about like the relationships between the community and the police. And so that's not the first thing. That's not the first emotion that was probably coming up for people when they embraced going to a meeting on that topic. So I guess it's just a very long way of saying, like, it's both the timing of the message, the timing of the involvement of the public, as well as really carefully scrutinizing how you're delivering that message, both in terms of the medium and in terms of the actual words being used.
So you're saying people need to practice crisis communication exercises, even with Twitter, Facebook, social media, not just real life scenarios, but online scenarios too.
Yeah. And I also want to say, can you believe that? I also want to say, though, that I've seen some best practice when it comes to crisis communication on social media. And there, I'm not just talking about public health, like a water crisis, but I mean, for one thing, we all are seeing, unfortunately, the usage of Twitter in times of a active shooting situation. But I've seen folks tweet at the police, "Hey, we saw what happened. Reach out if you need a statement," via Twitter. Um, and that be seen by the police in a way that was helpful, or in a flooding incident, people have tweeted an address for rescue, and that's been responded to. So I want
Or
to
marking
be
yourself
very
as safe or
Yeah.
something,
yeah. So I just want to be careful to say that, like, I'm not advocating for abandoning the
No.
platforms that have attracted billions of people. I mean, let's make highest and best use of what's in the toolkit, and those
Right.
platforms are there. And I'm not I haven't mentioned Instagram, I haven't mentioned Nextdoor, I haven't, there's a lot that we could talk about, but I want to suggest that those are probably tools in the box, not the subtotal of the box.
Yeah.
And that to your point just then, each of them needs to be, I mean, you're not going to take a hammer and just like crush it against a wall, without knowing how that's gonna go. So
Yeah.
let's check that out
We
before
have to
we.
start, as public officials and as cities, we have to start respecting those tools, using them as tools, respecting them as, that same, or valuing them in that same way that we would value the press releases, phone calls, or whatever, other methods of communication. And until they start doing that, like, they're going to be hit with these trolls and not know what to do with it. And
Yeah,
it's
and
easy to shut down, but shutting down is not the way that you're supposed to communicate with your community.
right. And I think that it's helpful for you to mention press release and kind of press conference and stuff, because I think that I have seen some pretty cool, like, media training that's happening these days. I'm sure
Yes.
you guys probably do some of it, and uh, I think that's something people have learned to take seriously, that they shouldn't just assume, especially in a heated kind of moment, that they're going to say all the right things in either an interview or a press conference or even a press release, and to know which ones to use in which cases. And so this is not all that different in terms of the significance and severity of the consequences, if it's not thought through thoroughly enough.
Yeah. Well, I love that you kind of put that the power of things like social, because it's on a phone, because it's an app, because it's something that a 12-year-old uses. A lot of times people in government are like, I can wing it. That's like me taking a chainsaw out of a box and like trying to just wing it. Like you have the
Or a
potential
12-year-old taking a chainsaw.
exactly, like you have
There's a lot of power in your hands.
there's a lot of power there, and it can be used for good or evil. So it's
Right.
just thank you for
Yeah,
stressing
and
the importance of that.
for sure. And also I sometimes hear, well, the person is anonymous, and so, like,
Mm.
is that even a person? And if they are, do they live in this community? Whatever. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't necessarily matter that much. I mean, first of all, I think platforms like Nextdoor are doing a great job of, and they're not the only ones. There's some others that I can talk about, but there are some that are doing a great job of really authenticating who's responding and really getting a good, clear sense of it being from someone in that particular place,
Right.
with that name even. But that's, we talk about it being anonymous. I mean, there are some communities where if you speak to the city council, you have to give your name and address, but a lot of
Yeah.
them you don't. They certainly don't check ID. I could say I'm John Smith and live at 123 Main, and they're not going to look at my license.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, if I send an email to City Hall or to this legislature, it can come from anywhere. So this whole idea that it somehow is worth less because it's quote unquote anonymous, I would take issue with. Now, would I strive to get as much data on who's responding as I could? 100%. When we built speakupboston.org, we certainly had in mind an interface and a back end that would allow us to really know where we were hearing from, who we were hearing from, and from where, particularly when we got single member council districts. So I think it's important to know as much about who's participating as you can, but to say we got tweets and we don't know who these people are, and therefore it's not consequential,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I love that we got on the topic of social media, because this is actually a great segue to the next question, because social media is definitely something that scares the bejesus out of city folk everywhere. And so what do you think the biggest fears or misconceptions are around public engagement, and how do you help people overcome those fears and move forward?
Well, I mean, one of the fears I think is from, especially when you're thinking about a utility, you have so many folks with tremendous expertise and education in this space. And so I think one fear is that they're going to open themselves up to taking a direction that the utility itself is going to think is absurd, abhorrent, impractical, I don't know, bad.
Yeah.
And I think what's important to say about that is in a perfect world, the utilities position aligns super great with whatever the public's consensus is. In a more real world, I don't know how many folks are familiar with like what goes on in a zoning case, for example, but like my background, I see zoning cases happen where basically the developer comes in and says, I want to build X. So that's piece of paper one. The city says, we think that they should be able to build that or not, and here's why. That's piece of paper two. The planning commission says we agree or disagree, and that's piece of paper three. And then the nearby folks say we are supportive or not, and that's piece of paper four. We never say like, and therefore, because piece of paper four with the public's input on it says one thing, then throw the other pieces of paper out. We say, here's all four pieces of paper, and you all can make the decision. It's up to you. So when it comes to dealing with staff as a client, I'm often saying to them, look, I'm never going to tell you to change your professional recommendation. I'm never going to tell you to, pardon the expression for this podcast, water down your expertise. I'm going to tell you to keep an open mind. And when there are decisions that you haven't yet made and aren't in a rush to make, then withhold judgment until you hear what the public and stakeholders have to say. When it comes to the public, I want them to know that as sort of a semi-autonomous part of this whole equation, I'm going to ensure that their comments go directly to the people ultimately making the decision, whether that's administrative or political or whatever. In other words, that I'm not going to try to force a mashup between what the public said and what the quote unquote experts are saying. I say quote unquote because I think they're experts, but sometimes the public questions that.
It's true.
So I'm not going to force that. I'm not going to like, well, the public said this, but we're going to edit that part out and just keep the part where the utility agreed. No, I'm going to give you, a lot of times I give people unabridged data. Like literally, this is every single comment that we got on the website. This is every single email. Not that I'm expecting them to read it, but because I want everybody to know that this is public record and it's data and it's being protected. I also do the executive summary and the analysis, in which I'm saying this is the upshot of what we heard. And I'm not saying, and therefore that's what you should do. I'm just saying, this is what we heard from the public. This is what we're hearing from staff. This is where they're aligned and this is where they aren't. And from there, it's up to you. So that's one fear, I think, is that they're going to sort of open themselves up to taking a course of action that they don't want to take, that they feel ethically uncomfortable with, and so that's a problem. Certainly, I hear the fear of I'm going to be attacked, and some of that is I'm going to be physically attacked, which is really unfortunate. But sometimes it's just that I'm going to be verbally attacked, and I think that's one of the reasons that I get work actually. Not because I'm physically imposing or that I'm going to block a headlong assault on an official.
You're a buffer.
And by the way, I never am advocating for security personnel at meetings, and I'm happy to go into why, but I generally have never been in support of that. City Hall is a different story, but I'm not really a big proponent of that. But I think I have a job partly because either I'm able to coach folks on how to deal with stressful situations, and I'll give one quick example of that in a second, or that I'm there to kind of create that safe space for the healthy dialogue to occur, and for it to occur in a way that doesn't leave people feeling attacked, but does make sure that they hear what the public's saying and that the public hears what the staff is saying. The one quick anecdote, a client of mine, a city, was telling me that at some of their open houses, and interestingly enough, open houses often tend to get a lot of friction where you would least expect it. People think, oh, open house, fun, whatever, easy. Not always. And this client said that their staff was getting, attacked, I think mostly verbally, but attacked at some of these open houses. And so some of the coaching that I gave them was to interject when they were feeling uncomfortable to say, ma'am or sir, I'm sorry, I'm feeling uncomfortable, and I want to be able to address your question, but I'm not feeling very comfortable here. And they've told me since then that like that was big for them.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting into psychology more than like public engagement maybe or whatever, but I just think that that's a real fear because they've seen it play out. I use a video in my training where some of this plays out. It's not an unfounded fear in a way, but I think it's a fear that can be addressed both with some good training and with some help from an additional third party who's meant to be a neutral player between those potentially angry members of the public and concerned staff. I guess the other thing that I would say when it comes to fears is that it's going to take too long. I was actually just reading this morning about a sort of what appears to be like a multi-year process to make a decision that on the surface to me seemed not worthy of that much time, but I'd have to go into it more deeply to understand what's going on there. But, imagine Austin, our comprehensive plan took upwards of 2 or 3 years. I think that what people sort of underestimate when they hear that something might take several months or whatever is it goes back to that earlier analogy about primary care doctor versus emergency room. The primary care doctor, you might wait a while, but you're usually in and out of there in an hour and a half, 2 hours, if all goes well. Emergency room, not so much. If an agency gets to a place where they're putting out a fire, metaphorically, then chances are they're dealing with months, if not years of delay and rehash and whatever, especially on things like transportation or even trying to build a water treatment plant. That can take years more than it should have when the public didn't feel like they were consulted. And so when someone blanches at this is going to take too long, first of all, okay, let's be clear about what the time limit is. When does the budget run out? When do you need to make this decision? Fiscally, politically, is there a re-election issue where you want to try to get this done in the current administration or whatever? Let's understand what all of those dynamics are, and let's work on those time constraints. But let's also remember that this is designed to make your life be a lot easier and more smooth after, and save you from the months, if not years, of unwanted, unplanned for delays that you might experience otherwise. So that, and I think the expense, some people fear the expense of it. And again, it goes back to, would you rather spend the $30 copay or the $600 emergency room? Would you rather pay for some of that preventative work and exhaust yourself for a couple of months going to 50 meetings, but then have it be done, than spend months, if not years, trying to clean up the mess.
Yeah, it's being added to all of our future proposals. Emergency room or primary care.
Brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Oh God, don't get me started on that. So, we know water's incredibly complex industry, and it's very science and engineer heavy, and we have to do public notices from time to time that have this mandatory regulatory language. So what advice do you have for professionals working in the industry that's complex, who are communicating with public that generally have no working knowledge of what the industry does at all?
Yeah. So one funny thing about those notices is that I'm not sure that the newspaper here in my part of the world would be in business but for those notices.
Right? Oh my God.
Unbelievable
Yeah.
how the local section is basically like page 1 articles, page 2, 3, 4 notices.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful TED Talk, by the way, that kind of satirically tackles the whole public notice thing, and I'm going to have to dig up who gave it. And
yes, please.
But it's really great. I mean, basically, he takes apart he pretends that Nike was doing one of its ads.
Oh my gosh.
Via the public notice. So it's like,
yes.
Podiatric apparel firm seeks to convey product to residents of the United States of America.
That's awesome.
In order to encourage pedestrian activity or whatever it is,
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm not here to advocate for repeal of
Right.
laws that require those public notices. I
Sure.
will say that I do believe that we need a comprehensive look at what those requirements are and a rethink of what they should be. There's actually a sort of model ordinance and model statute for public participation that's floating out there that I'll send a link to. That's not so much meant to completely replace all that public notice stuff, but it's meant to say, like, we're kind of beyond that now. Let's come up with some new language. But as it relates to the notice, I mean, look, obviously we need to be compliant with the law.
Yep.
What I think would be nice is if an agency was able to take that quarter page and basically in an eighth of a page put the legal notice stuff, and in the bottom eighth of the page say, here's what all that means. One sentence, two sentence, hashtag, whatever, out the door. I've never had to be involved in the dissemination of a public, I mean, I've certainly worked on projects where public notices were happening, but I've never had to be in the room when they're drafting it. And so I'm sure I would vomit every meal I've ever eaten if I were, having to be associated with that. The writer in me just wouldn't be able to
It's
stand
a
it.
struggle. The struggle is real, Larry.
But one of the best practices to me is actually being able to communicate the same message, not just translated in different languages, but translated to different audiences.
Yeah.
Like
translated in
Human
layman
language.
Yeah.
right. Like what's a millennial going to say versus what a Gen Xer versus a senior versus. I mean, my favorite example that I just can think of right off the top is Nashville, Tennessee was doing its comprehensive plan, and it said, "Hey, Nashville, it's time to pick." And they literally had a 4-year-old picking his nose. I mean, they could have done like the guitar pick because it's Nashville, but they went,
That's an obvious connection.
And here I am, the parent of a 4-year-old. I'm like, that's the greatest dad I've ever seen. But going back to the kind of making public notices make sense. So I think there's a kind of putting a plain English alongside the stuff you're required to print. But I also think there is that kind of 7-year-old test and grandparent test. So, is what I'm about to say in this ad or this message or whatever something that one or both of those audiences are going to understand without my having to then elaborate and explain in more detail what I'm talking about. I mean, an example that I use during Imagine Austin, I mean, comprehensive planning is one of these things that's very hard for a lot of people to wrap their arms around. And so it was, give us 20 minutes to decide what the next 30 years of Austin should look like. Now, that's not probably advertising best practice or PR best practice, but it was basically saying, like, this is what comprehensive planning is in a nutshell. You can go to the website and read a lot more. You can read the public notice if you want to understand the legal ramifications. But to most people, all you need to know is we're asking for a little bit longer than a normal survey because we're planning for a little bit longer ahead than we usually do. So, I don't know that I'm giving either brain surgery kind of advice or rocket science, but I mean, I just think I get that public notices are here to stay for the time being. And I think anybody that assumes that they will get across anything to anyone are mistaken. I'm sure attorneys are reading them just because they can speak that language and probably want to show their clients they can, but they serve very limited purpose otherwise.
Yeah, it's great to have that validated, and also just to remind people that when you are doing the public notice that it's okay. It is perfectly okay. In fact, it's recommended to do that layman's term, recommendation or translation explanation, of what this legal, jargon.
Right. And the other thing that I think is worth saying, since we're talking to a lot of folks who work for utility, is that every utility is different. I know some utilities have gotten away from a paper statement, or they're letting people opt out, but it doesn't matter whether it's a paper statement or electronic. I'm pretty sure every utility is still sending statements out on a monthly basis in one form or another, or at least you have a dashboard where you could get an alert and go look at it. That's a very handy way to get a message out to your public about something that they're otherwise only going to hear about in a public notice. So don't even worry about a better design, more complex design on a quarter-page ad, if that's going to create headaches for anybody you're working with, just take the tools right there in your toolbox and put it to work for you. That's something we certainly leaned on with Austin Energy a ton, because they were the ones that would send the bills.
Love it.
So sometimes I use this analogy or metaphor that the water industry can sometimes be like a woman's worst first date. And because sometimes we only talk
Since no one
about
can see me, I would like to posit that I am in fact a man. Don't have really much to, I don't know if I'm going to be able to help use this or not, but
Okay, so it doesn't just anyone's worst
Okay.
first date. Okay, it doesn't have to be a woman. It could be a man or a woman, but just worst first date. So like the other person only talks about themselves or only about negative things, because like you said, only when there's an emergency. So a boil water notice or a rate increase or something along those lines. So, and we have what seems to be our own language and jokes that no one else understands, and this results in public meetings that from the get-go start with this whole like mob killing the messenger vibe. So how do you diffuse that? And you kind of talked a little bit about it, but that whole like, "Urgh."
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think your example earlier of, I think it was Cincinnati, where they went around to so many different organizations, is very apt, because it's the agencies that have spent the time meeting with people when the temperature is average or low, that I think are going to find those exchanges to be a lot easier to handle than the people where they've just, this is the first time they're hearing from the utility. I, I just think that relationships matter, and that's when people say like build trust. I mean, this is talked about a lot in the conflict resolution field, like the mediator needs to build trust. I mean, I feel like what they're really saying is, A, show that you know what you're talking about, and B, have some sort of relationship. In other words, not appear to be this kind of generic faceless entity that's just spewing information, but be a human being that's connecting with the other human being in a meaningful way. So, I mean, one thing I would say about that is, let's say, I mean, the example I was using before, where the staff were getting uncomfortable with some of what the public was telling them. A lot of times that would be preceded by the public basically saying, you're going to, and then lay out this completely preposterous scenario of what they thought the government was planning to do. You're going to destroy my property value, or you're going to flood my lawn, or whatever the doomsday scenario was that they'd cooked up.
Or even just, you can't tell me what to do.
Right. Right. That's a good one. I think that where I always start from is, and I know it's now become kind of trite, but meeting the person where they are. So take the ones that we were just talking about. Sir or ma'am, if someone told me that they were going to flood my lawn, I'd be pretty upset. If someone told me that you're about to destroy the value of a property that I've spent 25 years in, like I have my house, I'd be scared and angry and anxious. If you told me that you were going to restrict my freedom, or not allow me to do something that's really important to me on my property, I'd feel a lot of things about that. So I want to explain to you kind of what I feel like we're trying to do here, and see if that helps you to understand this in a different light. I'm not saying I'm going to convince you that you're mistaken. I'm not even going to really try. I'm simply going to share with you what this looks like from our vantage point, and why this is important to us. And hopefully your hearing that will help you to see it in a different way. Not, I feel like the reflex in situations like that is defensiveness. And one defensive thing that often happens in public meetings is the no decision has been made reflex, which I think is almost always accurate, but immediately makes people think that a decision has been made. It's sort of like the huge watermark on a lot of Microsoft Word documents that says draft. That you even need to write that, and especially in such a pronounced way, I think has people just immediately like, oh, they're calling this a draft, but maybe it's not so drafty. And I think the same goes for, no decision has been made, or that's not true. Someone might come back with that, or that's, sir, you're just way off base. Or, I mean, those may very well be the legitimate thoughts that person is having at the moment. And I'm not a model citizen when it comes to always saying the thing that I should say as opposed to the thing that I'm, feeling.
Sure.
But I do think that, first of all, the more that the agency can anticipate what some of that is going to be and prepare responses, the better. I mean, we always, think in terms of a frequently asked questions document or part of our website, and there's no reason not to think about that in terms of a presentation. So that's number one. But number two is, lead with empathy. I mean, I know
Yeah.
I know that I know that this may air, or this may come out a lot way after President George H.W. Bush's funeral, but it was just yesterday when we're recording this, and that was a big thing with him. And I think that, it's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people that weren't Republicans respected him, because he just seemed to connect with people no matter what they felt about him, no matter what they felt about his policies, no matter how they disagreed on how they saw the world, et cetera. The Cold War ending without violence, I think, is a great example of that. I think he and the Russians and the Soviets really related to each other in that way. So, getting back from the tangent, I just think that
I'll
it
let
can
you
be
give
really.
George H.W. a shout out.
There you
George
go.
H. Bush, not George H.W.
Well, I didn't finish with the Bush, but
But I think that there are so many reflexes that can kick in when we're in these kind of tough public meetings, and so I think it's important to know what those are going to be. What are some of those triggers going to be, and what can I lead with that's going to come across as empathy rather than sort of serve and volley, that I think will be kind of productive. But the other piece is kind of peeling back from that difficult room and thinking about what can I do to prevent even that room from coming about. And I think that that's all in the relationship, both with individuals in terms of constant communication, and with organizations. Real quick anecdote, I'm struck by living here in Fort Lauderdale, how often I hear from my kids' school. And it's so much so, I mean, we happen to live in the school district where Marjorie Stoneman Douglas is. And so Broward County schools have come in for tremendous criticism for what all went on with the person that, is on trial for that those shootings and those killings. And I have to say that even though I'm led to think that there's some things that the school district could have done differently, the fact that they have been so communicative with us as a family for now a year and a half is kind of reason for me to kind of wonder if the criticism is really all accurate or not. And I'm sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt, I feel like, just because I hear from them as often as I do, and I know my son's teachers, and I know the assistant principal and the principal, and I just sort of feel like these are people that I can trust because I know them, because I hear from them a lot, as opposed to all of a sudden out of the blue, like, don't let your kids drink the water at our school or whatever, like something that would be like totally, out of left field. I mean, they've had to make security changes at my kid's school because of the pressure from what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. I don't think anybody's given them a hard time about that. Not just because they want their kids to be safe, but because they trust the administration. They trust that because they've heard so much so consistently, both from central office and from the school itself, that, they've got our best intentions at heart.
So I don't want to take us too far down this rabbit hole, but I have to ask this question because I'm a nerd and I have to know why. But you mentioned in those conversations where you suggested that they say, I'm starting to get a little uncomfortable. Does that work because it's kind of disarming to the person who's attacking them? I'm using air quotes because it's kind of like calling them out and like kind of making them say, oh, like what I'm saying is impacting this person.
So what I'm relaying to you on that is secondhand, but the answer is yes. I mean, they have told me that when they say something like that, they immediately get a reaction of, oh, that's not what I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't mean to, or I'm just trying to get answers. Like they definitely try to take it away from you are a bad person to
Yeah.
I just need you to help me. I'm upset.
Yeah.
So at least it becomes depersonalized and more productive.
Okay.
Again, this is first of all strictly anecdotal, and second of all
Right.
secondhand.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've been in a situation. The thing that comes to mind in terms of a situation like that was having people in small groups discussing something and having one small group get heated enough that a man slammed his hand on the table with such force that it sounded like a gun had gone off.
Oh,
And so
no.
I then had to just go over and visit with him and with the woman that had agitated him separately and figure out a way to calm them down.
Sure.
But I do remember saying to him something that might be relevant here, which is I could have said, "Sir, we're not going to have that here. Sir, you need to leave." Something kind of punitive, and I didn't. I said, first of all, I asked him to tell me what was going on. He's obviously upset, and then I said, "What is it that you think we can do to enable you to kind of participate here? Because obviously, I mean, we can't do that, but what else can we do to kind of make this? Because I understand you guys have a disagreement, but we've got kids here. I mean, we need to be cognizant of who's in the room and how to make this productive." And they both stayed. I'm not saying that it's because of me that they did stay. I think though that had I told him to leave, I probably would be hearing about it for days and weeks. I mean, he probably would have let somebody know.
You had angry emailed a lot of people.
Yes, and tweeted angrily.
For sure. So, yeah, lead with empathy.
I love it. Okay, I want to know, how do we get more people to show up at these public meetings, Larry? How do we get them engaged during this process? Just how are we going to get their feedback?
Yeah, there's so much there.
How do I get more than 20?
So you're right. So there's kind of the how do we get people to show up question, and I think the two things the two or three things that come to mind are a compelling ask, a compelling invite, and then the resources for them to participate. Okay, so let's do the resources one first. Is the meeting being held somewhere that's got parking and or public transit and or bike and pedestrian?
Public transit. Thank you.
Is it a place that's going to be easy to navigate when I get there? Like I've had meetings at public schools, could be private schools, but at schools
down
where
this corridor, turn to the left, go down that hall, open.
Yeah, it's like once you park, like that's half the battle. Like you actually spend more time from the car to the room than you did driving there.
Is a good rule of thumb, like if you have to have more than 2 directional signs, you're too confusing.
Yeah, too confusing.
Correct. And by the way, let's I mean, one project I was proud of doing was sort of inventorying all the spaces where I thought we could have meetings, and I tried to not limit myself just to like city facilities, for example. So I definitely encourage people to look at even private facilities that they can get for reasonable amounts. I mean, in fact, Stephanie's in the project. Stephanie talked about it. We were at churches. I mean, that's fine. I mean, if they're available and reasonable, that's fine. The key is to be, in an accessible space, and I mean that both in a legal term, like accessible to every physical handicap, disability, but also accessible in terms of people being able to get to it, and also not be wed, by the way, to starting at 6 o'clock. I mean, I've encouraged people to look at 7 or early 7 p.m. or before 6, because 5 to 6 tends to be like the worst for mobility. Yeah. So to not be wed to 6 o'clock as a start time, I think is important. The other components, though, of the meeting being accessible are simultaneous interpretation in another language or languages, which often means, it often means, I mean, best practice would be a headset that somebody could check out at the meeting and be listening to someone real time interpreting it.
Yeah.
And that's expensive on the front end, but it's not so expensive over the length of time that you might be using it, especially if you buy it, the set, rather than rent it. But also having activities with supervision available for children. I said what I said earlier about not going to meetings that are during family time. I mean, I don't want to sit here and pretend that I would definitely go to a meeting on a topic of interest to me just because there were supervised children's activities. But I spent 6 months working on kind of a standard operating procedure for that very thing for Austin, because I just think that we are missing a lot of participation from families who just think like, I don't want my kid to have a meltdown. I don't want them to be tugging on me the whole time. I don't want to miss dinner. I don't, just everything that goes into parenting that public meetings often interfere with. Now, one funny thing on that is when I did one of my televised town halls, a neighbor friend across the street tweeted, just gave the kids a bath and I'm brushing their teeth and I'm listening to Larry Schooler's disembodied voice in my ear, because that was great for him. Like he could be the dad he needed to be, but also pay at least some semblance of attention to the topic because we were on TV.
Nice. I love
so for what that's worth. How else to get people to meetings? There's a big difference between saying the water utility, and I'll even go back to Stephanie's example in Fort Worth. I don't remember the specific outreach we used in that case. It's been a few years, but there's a big difference between saying we're having a meeting about water restrictions and we are working to address an upcoming shortage in our water supply and we need your help. Another difference would be we're having a meeting about bond referenda or potential bond referenda versus we have about $1.5 billion in needs in this community, but only $400 million to spend. How would you spend it? The call to action is important, not just in terms of it being a call to action. I mean, first of all, that it's not just passive, like we're having this meeting, but a call to action, make your voice heard kind of thing, but also in terms that make sense and are going to matter. And so I just think that most of our meetings are kind of titled and framed in a way that doesn't create any sort of sense of urgency. And I think that's important. The last thing I would say is don't be afraid to sort of co-host with a variety of different other co-hosts. I mean, I think that certainly having a table kind of presence at other people's events is great. I mean, that's not as much as having your own meeting would accomplish, but it's still something, especially if you can come up with a real short exercise or survey for people to take. And I've done a lot of that. But I think also even just the idea of co-hosting an event, in other words, the meeting is co-hosted by, I don't know if they still have it, but Steer Fort Worth and whatever, or it's hosted by the Chamber and the city, or it's hosted by the Interfaith Alliance or
a disarming group.
Yeah, like
a disarming group and a group that's got sort of built-in trust. That I'm going to open an email from. I think the challenge oftentimes with getting people to meetings is where they actually end up hearing about it, and if they hear about it in passing on the news, are they really going to change their schedule to go to it if they don't even really fully know what it's going to be about and think it's going to be bad, as compared to opening it up from their pastor or their clergy or their chamber president or their HOA president or whatever and being like, well, I'm going to open this because I care about this organization. And even if they're just the messenger saying, go to this city meeting, that could still be more valuable than seeing it in passing or trying to decipher the public notice or whatever. So I think a lot of it has to do with how people hear about the meetings that are taking place. But the last thing I would say about that is just to not, there's almost no scenario that I can imagine where a strategy of doing engagement just with public meetings is going to work. The only scenario I could think of is maybe if you're dealing strictly with a neighborhood issue that only people in that neighborhood would be impacted by or care about.
Right.
Maybe in that case you could get away with just public meetings, but in almost every scenario I could think of, you're going to want to have other ways of allowing people to engage.
So you have this very calming, composed persona, and anyone listening can kind of hear that in your voice. And when you,
it's a good thing you don't mic it up like my house at time or get out of the house time.
Oh, whoa, hey. when you facilitate, because I've seen you like run the room, and is that innate, or is that practice, or both? Like, how can someone get better at being a stellar facilitator?
Well, first of all, it's nice of you to say. My dad is an attorney. My mom trained as a social worker, so I really think that mashup is a good one for a facilitator because my dad and I both have these kind of deep, kind of forceful voices, and my mom, being a social worker, is definitely big on empathy and stuff. And so I feel like that combination has been very helpful to me. But for those who don't have parents in those two professions, I mean, it's funny you asked this question just because I do a lot of facilitation training of other people, and I structure the training in such a way that the upshot that I'm trying to leave them with is that you can do this, that I don't know you and I still think you can do this. Now, I do this little, what I call pop quiz at the beginning, and it's 10 questions that I think, and I'll have to look them up honestly because I can't remember them all, but they are designed to kind of leave people at the end with a sense as to whether they've got it down and they really don't even, they could teach the class to me, or they really should, pay particularly close attention. Some of the questions are things like, how good are you at staying on task and keeping a group focused? But some of them are things like, what happens if you get criticized? How do you manage being criticized even in the course of a meeting on your performance? Some people will literally will criticize my facilitation in the moment that I'm facilitating. And so, obviously I've got to thicken my skin in those cases and be able to roll with that. So I guess I would say, do I think that there are some verbal and nonverbal and vocal and other kinds of things that are helpful to facilitators? Sure. And I coach people on that. I mean, my training includes simulation and kind of role play mock facilitation. And I certainly am giving people feedback on that. Sure. But I have noticed that, like when I'm in situations where I'm being facilitated, it's interesting sometimes how I think I'm better facilitated in ways that are different than how I would facilitate, if that makes any sense. Like, I feel sometimes like, I mean, my dad is not it's funny, I'm a mediator, my dad's an arbitrator, and that's perfectly, wow. That makes perfect sense. Like he's not the kind of like, tell me how that made you feel, he's more of the, so what you're saying is, kind of guy.
You've had a lifelong practice right there.
Yeah.
Well, and so, so sometimes like I need somebody who's going to, I've worked with professionals where I need somebody who is just going to kind of really get like inside of what I'm saying and pull out what I'm really trying to say. Which isn't always the way I approach things as a facilitator. Like I'm not always sort of forcing someone to get to, encouraging somebody to get to the point faster or whatever. Sometimes I'm really letting it breathe, but other times I am trying to get them to kind of, so what I hear you saying is this. So I guess the answer to your question is I really don't think any of it is innate. And I don't think that it's something that can't, and I don't think that it's something that can't be acquired by a variety of folks. I mean, I think it takes more than anything else. It takes a commitment, not necessarily to a bunch of training. There's plenty of training out there, but I don't know that it's about number of hours of training or being a certified professional facilitator, which is a thing. I think it's more about the commitment to some of the things that have to be done by facilitators to be successful, to be patient, to be willing to listen to people say things that you completely disagree with and maybe even find offensive. Right. And I don't mean to sort of add that level of edge to it, but when you're facilitating, I mean, I facilitated as an Austin resident on topics in Austin for a number of years. And so I was actually facilitating on things where I definitely had an opinion. Mm-hmm. I didn't share that opinion with anybody in that meeting, but people would say things and I would think to myself, like, what the heck is that guy talking about? Or that's ridiculous. Knowing full well that I would never, say something like that. So I think it's much more about, like I said, sort of an inner commitment to a certain set of practices and styles without it being something that you can't do because your personality or your upbringing or whatever wouldn't allow it.
Right.
So. Well, and not to be honest, after having spoken with you for longer, I kind of feel like it's because you lead with empathy, and I feel that that's genuine and it comes across. And I feel like that's kind of the calming aspect of it is you don't come in hot, you come in calm. Right. And like, you convey that empathy like so genuinely that people are like, okay, this guy is not going to take a side, or he's not here to take a side. Like he really is trying to like foster this.
Well, and I think that I appreciate you saying that, but I think that there's leading with empathy in terms of the words I say, but then there's also like, as you just put it, like if I don't feel some of what it is that I'm saying, it doesn't really matter. And probably someone can tell, like if I just say like, I understand your pain, sir. I mean, people used to joke about that with President Clinton before he got, I feel your pain, like,
oh, good.
so
yeah, that was good.
So I think that it's, especially when I was facilitating in Austin and it was about stuff that was going to matter to me at some point, it was, I won't say easier, but it certainly was like more accessible for me to hit that point because I was feeling some of what they were feeling about that issue. Now, most of the time when I'm facilitating, I'm not in that circumstance. But I try very hard to say, and this is especially important, I think, I'll just be blunt, as an educated middle-class white man.
Right.
There are people that look at me as soon as I walk in the room and assume I won't get it. And I had a couple of interesting teachable moments very early in my career where that was the charge out of the gate, that I don't get it. And I honor their opinion. I'm not going to sit here and debate whether I do or don't get it. But I also think it's just so to do this work in the country that we live in, and for that matter, the world that we live in, you have to find ways to get it. And you also can recruit the person talking to you who may think you're not getting it to say, please help me. Mm-hmm. Like I want to understand this. Like I'm doing everything I can to tap into what it is that you're feeling, and you're not feeling like I get it is upsetting to me. So I really want to understand where this is coming from. It's funny because there's that friends of ours that are going to these community meetings. It's around an affordable housing development that they don't want to see come into their neighborhood. And this is something that I've thought about a lot because in Austin, we lived in a neighborhood that was mixed in terms of income and had affordable housing within the neighborhood. And I've often thought to myself, like, when someone is so, resolutely against something that I'm in my personal life, like very much supportive of, or would be. And if you ask me, like, what words will I use? Like, what will I say? I'm talking about as a facilitator, not as their friend. I'm saying as a facilitator, like, what would I say in order to, because I don't want to lie, but I also don't want to be, as Stephanie said, like ingenuine, insincere. So, I can see why you would think that, or I'm sure that the idea of being unsafe is really upsetting, like sort of precise language that doesn't come off as being like talking point rehearsed, but still like carefully chosen so that I'm not saying like, man, that would suck, if I don't think that, or whatever. So anyway.
Well, I know someone whose 3 core values are to be kind, genuine, and to have empathy. And I've been thinking about that a lot as you've been talking. And I'm like, oh, those sound like some pretty powerful core values for somebody who's doing the work that you're doing. So
I'm sorry, Stephanie. One other thing I wanted to say about the empathy piece is I've had a couple of funky situations where the client, meaning the agency and the staff at that agency, got uncomfortable with my facilitating because they thought I was taking the side of the public that was being critical. Okay. And I think that that's important as a learning, opportunity, because I mean, let me be blunt about it. Like I would say almost removed from a project partly because of this issue that some staff members were having, where they felt that I was just doing the bidding of certain activists, I guess.
Sure.
And I think it's really important. People talk all the time in facilitation and public engagement about neutrality and objectivity. And I think it needs to be understood in this way, which is nobody is neutral as an individual. Like, none of us are neutral people. Like, we have opinions, we have values, and nobody is objective on all things. In fact, on most things, we're not. The key is to demonstrate that in the work that we're doing. And so I try to let the client know, staff or whoever going in, like, there are going to be times when I'm going to press you for an answer to something because I think that the citizen isn't satisfied with what you've said so far, or they didn't get what they needed out of that answer. And I need you to know that I'm doing that because I want you guys to be successful and get a better outcome with that member of the public, not because I'm on their side. And I think that that's important, because if the empathy comes across as like, well, you're just this, touchy-feely, like, citizens advocate, it's the difference, I think, between being kind of an ombudsman and a facilitator. Like, an ombudsman really is supposed to be kind of the public's voice to an organization. Like, NPR has an ombudsman, and I feel like she's really meant to convey something to the organization. That's not me. I mean, I'm not in that role most of the time. So I just think the client, the utility, or whoever it is that I'm working with, needs to know that about me, so that kind of doesn't get misunderstood in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, instead, it didn't take a great deal of courage to, to have those conversations and to build those relationships, but that, nothing worth having is easy. So
For sure.
So before we get into our lightning round, where we ask you some questions, including what your favorite book is, we know that you're working on a book. So can you tell us about that? And I think it's on how the public can help resolve big conflicts.
Yeah. So some people who are listening may be familiar with kind of Nelson Mandela and South Africa when everything was changing there. So, of course, there was a lot of racial animosity, and then Nelson Mandela took over. And there was the potential for there to be greater strife, because now, blacks were in position of power that whites had been in before. But rather than undertaking a lot of sort of war crimes tribunal prosecutions, he chose to undertake something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this is something that other countries had done before, but I really think South Africa made it famous. And it was this idea of appointing non-jurists, not judges, or jurors, but lay people, to openly gather public and sometimes private testimony and statements from people affected by what had happened there, and then to render recommendations and judgments that were not sort of binding on the government, but were meant to be kind of like advice as to what to do to move South Africa forward. This is something that has now gotten picked up in depending on how you define it, this is something that's gotten picked up in 2 major places in the United States and then in Canada. And as I got interested in this, it was partly just kind of in its own little silo, like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's kind of cool. But as I got into it, I realized that what really fascinated me was that anybody could come forward and participate, that it wasn't about being subpoenaed or called as a witness and then sort of carefully cross-examined. It was actually an open call to participate in moving the city, state, or country forward. Yeah. And so that's what the book is really about. It's kind of how a community or a state or a nation can work as a country or a state or a community to address something that had been haunting those places for quite some time. So a conflict that goes beyond just a single officer involved shooting or a particular land use case or a transportation challenge, but something that's been an issue for, years, if not decades. So my hope is that people will read it and think this could be an interesting way for us to work through some things that are really hard for us to talk about and work through. It's essentially the publication of my dissertation, which means that it could end up as a doorstop. So I'm trying to figure out how to write it in a way that people will read it beyond the professors that are reading my dissertation. But I do believe that it'll be written in a way that'll at least it could get assigned to students, and they might.
I know a writer.
You let us know. You let us know when it comes out, and
sure.
We'll be sure to come talk about that again.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Sounds great.
Sounds exciting. Okay, Larry, I want to know, what is, besides the book that you're working on, what is the favorite book right now that you can recommend to all of us?
Oh, well, I mean, I literally stayed up until 2:00 in the morning and almost made it all the way through in one sitting. This
Wow.
novel called The Great Believers, which
Ooh.
is on a bunch of lists. I mean, if you Google it,
Yeah.
I mean, if you'd ask me like my favorite book of all time, I'd probably go with like something by Mark Twain or maybe All the King's Men or something. But if
Okay.
it's like what I just am engrossed by now, this is a novel that's I think I think it would be considered a historical novel because it's basically set in the mid 80s when the AIDS crisis was at
Wow.
epidemic stages, and it's
Mhm.
really ironic. I mean, I know that it came out earlier this year, well before George H.W. Bush passed away, but it's really interesting to be reading it right as we're talking about Bush and Reagan's legacy on AIDS.
Sure.
And so,
Mm.
and it's got a ton of like family drama and amazing like connections from two different generations. And I mean, as I said, I mean, I started at like 8:30 and at 2:00 in the morning, I just thought I should probably sleep, not knowing that I'm not feeling tired and not wanting to stop
Yeah.
reading. So
Wow.
that's probably a sign of a good
Yeah,
book.
it's a good book.
So yeah, so I recommend that without reservation.
Yeah. Okay, what's something that drives your productivity?
Well, I mean, stereotypically, I think a lot of people are more productive when they exercise, and I certainly think that.
Boring. I'm just kidding.
So that's why I'm going to give. That's why I have to think of something else.
I can't. I don't ever get to exercise.
We need
so-
something.
No,
that-
I'm not a model. I'm not a good. Yeah, I mean, my exercise can be once a week or
Just kidding.
5 times a week, and everything in between. But I do find because like when I work out, I basically listen to Water in Real Life or something like it, and so invariably, like because I'm sort of thinking more about whatever it is that I'm listening to, and I'm really listening, like there's not really any other distraction. That's a powerful time for me to either generate an idea or think of something that I should do later on. I mean, there's a couple things that I do that are very particular to me that are that make a big difference, like prayer and sort of Bible study.
Nice.
And it's nice because no matter where you live now, you can find that, not just in person, but virtually. I was joking earlier about the number of pages taken up by public notices because I have the newspaper delivered to my doorstep, much to my wife's consternation. And I find that is really good because,
Sure.
I mean, especially when you read the New York Times, but even when you read the local paper, it's impossible to read them and not have some impulse to do something to respond to what you've read. Now, am I saying don't listen to NPR or watch CNN? No. I mean, I'm not. And those other media outlets can have similar kinds of impacts, especially NPR. But for me, I just find that being able to read it and the level of depth that a paper can often go into matters, and it's not going to happen for me if it's online only because I'm just online too much, and so I don't want to pull up the computer when I first wake up in the morning.
Right.
So that's why it's important to me to take the paper, and hold it. And that's true, by the way, I find this sort of disheartening. Like a lot of times when I travel, it takes a real effort to get the local paper, which is a whole other topic. But like, it's so important to my productivity when I'm traveling because not just like psychologically, like I read the paper, but like I've got to have something to talk about later in the day with whoever I'm dealing with who lives there.
Yeah.
And most of the time, what's on the local news, like on TV or on the radio even, is not something that they're going to want to talk about.
Yeah.
So, it's productivity, like mentally in terms of that, but also in terms of just like, I need something to break the ice with whoever I'm working with later that day.
Yeah, love it.
Well, I love that you kind of perfectly segued about getting empowered or pumped up by reading the paper and feeling called to action. That's actually my final question is that, I'm sure you're familiar with doing any kind of engagement or education and outreach. We have people that will say, well, who cares if I change? I'm just one person. I can't make a big difference. I mean, I think about like voting, even like I'm just one person, but we obviously disagree with that. And we believe that one person making a change can be contagious and cause even more change further down the road. So what is the one call to action that you're most passionate about that you believe could ultimately change the world? Some Tikkun Olam for you. I'll throw that in.
I am mazel tov. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess I'll answer it with an anecdote that hopefully will get me to a real answer, which is that I went to the Miami Dolphins game the other day with my father-in-law, and we had the worst time getting home. I mean, it's so silly. I mean, most sporting events can be a challenge, but this was an epic challenge. I mean, I'm talking about a 30-minute ride to get to the stadium became upwards of 90 to 120 minutes to get home. And it had actual real consequences. My mother-in-law is disabled, and so the aide had to leave a full hour before we got home because of that. Now, nothing bad happened, thank God. I mean, I'm not trying to paint too dramatic a picture, but it was upsetting beyond just like, I don't like traffic. Like it was actually like had real consequences. And so, I think most people would be like, that stunk. I'm either not going to go to the Dolphins game again, or I'll Uber there, or just some like fairly low level change they would make. This nerd wrote an email to his own state rep and state senator, and the state rep and state senator that rep the area around the stadium, and the county commissioner. And so that you're not totally freaked out, the reason that I wrote to the state people is because they closed Florida Turnpike. And so it was like, why did you do that? Like, what, I used the pike to get there. Why did you close it as a like primary way for us all to get out of there?
Right.
And to the credit of my own representatives, they've already responded within a day or two.
Awesome.
Now, I don't have like a definitive answer yet or anything, but I am pleased that they responded personally.
Yeah.
And so there was also a story that I saw and sent to some friends recently about a 9-year-old, I forget where, I'll have to find it, who discovered that there was a local ordinance that essentially banned snowball fights.
I saw the headlines for this.
And I don't remember how it was written. I mean, I don't think it literally said like, thou shalt not throw a snowball, but it was definitely like construed in that way. And so this 9-year-old ended up speaking before city council, and they repealed the darn thing. I mean, they figured out a way to permit snowball fights.
I see where you're going, Larry, and I like it.
What a brave political, move that was. But I mean, the upshot, I guess, would be that like, I defy someone to sort of walk around wherever they live or work and not find something that they think should change. They walk along a sort of urban street and see, a really high profile homeless presence, and think about what needs to happen there. They are stuck in traffic and they think about the mobility piece. They, are living on the outskirts of a community because they can't afford to live closer in, and can't find affordable stuff. There's something for everybody. And if for some reason there's not something for you personally, there's probably something for someone that you care about, that needs to change. And I guess in my world, like the key is to figure out who could potentially change it most readily and contact the person. There's a lot more to it than that, because I think that the reality of how change happens in America is that it takes lots of people thinking the same way. It also takes some money and some other kinds of influence. The ballot matters, and that everybody should vote in every single election that they're eligible to vote in, and that they can have influence beyond it, and that they should do all that they can to leverage that influence. So that is one of the least concisely worded and most sort of inarticulately rendered answers to that question, probably. But I mean, I just, I don't think that was something that my parents taught me to do, but they certainly took me to the ballot box, from a very early age. And I certainly was aware of who my elected officials were at a very young age, and
Sure.
got fortunate enough to intern for one or two of them. So, I just think it's not that they're sitting around by the phone waiting to be contacted, but they are wanting to make a difference in the lives of people who need it. One other final story. So there's a city in North Carolina near where I was living at that time that was deciding whether or not to go to single member districts for city council. And so I was trying to figure out a way to tell that story. And I found an older man who, from his home, could get in his motorized wheelchair, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and get all the way to the store. And that was the way I opened the story, because essentially the point was that his city councilman, who because of these changes now represented his neighborhood and whom he knew, had made something happen that he had been trying for years to make happen before that. And so that to him was the significance of, representation or whatever, not some abstract, like, how do we draw the lines and are they compact districts enough or whatever, but it mattered that someone listened to what he said and did something.
Quality of life, yeah.
That's right. That made a huge difference in his quality of life. So I guess the core message is, without knowing it, you have a lot of potential in you to find ways to change your or someone else's world. So go start.
Well, we dig that 100%
I love
because we
that.
believe that one, and even better, two people can start a revolution. So that's what we're aiming for.
Viva.
This means war.
Viva!
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. I love that.
Definitely. The pleasure was mine. And, I appreciate the interest from folks listening in this particular aspect of their work. And, at the risk of ending on a cheesy note, I mean, it's so easy to take for granted the, widespread availability of drinkable and usable water, especially when it's very clear how many parts of the world don't have it. So for those who are listening that work at a utility or work at a place where they provide water, we really appreciate that. Good stuff. Thanks for the water.
All right. You're going to make me tear up.